Hi, good morning. Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to our NCA seminar titled Learning the Three C's, Becoming a Competent Classroom Communicator. My name is Scott Myers. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at West Virginia University. Today, our topic is teaching from the student perspective. And what we're going to focus on primarily are two things. One, we're going to discuss the impressions that students make about us. And these are things sometimes we don't think as much about, but they can have an effect on what happens in the classroom. And then we're going to talk also about the reasons why students are motivated to communicate with us. And just share a little bit with how these motives can explain why students talk with us during and outside of class. But before we do that, and I alluded to this yesterday, is I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the different needs that students bring with them to the classroom. Now, traditionally, I would say that these are things that college instructors haven't thought about or haven't been really instructed to think about. But pragmatically, as most of us know, students come into the classroom, bringing a whole host of experiences with them. They often operate or communicate with us based on their own traits, which have nothing to do with us per se, but yet sometimes we think that they do. But what I wanted to talk about for just a second, and K through 12 teachers are very familiar with this because they deal with this quite a bit of the time, is that our students come to us with a set of needs, and these needs can be broken down into a couple of different areas, which I'll talk to you about in a second. They come to us with a range of communication anxieties, as we know. The student who's shy, the student who's communicatively apprehensive, the student who isn't that competent of a communicator. They also come to us with learning modalities, where most of us are familiar with the notion of, the auditory learner, the visual learner, the kinesthetic learner. So those are things we contend with. But we have to stop and think about the basic needs that some of our students have. Now, when you think about student needs, your mind first might go to Maslow, which makes perfect sense. That's one that I think that a lot of us are familiar with. The idea that, if students' lower level needs aren't met, then their higher level needs can't be met. And again, as college instructors, although this isn't really what we've been trained or even expected to do, we do recognize that some of our students have physiological needs or safety needs, or even love and belongingness needs that aren't being met somewhere else. And while we may not take it upon ourselves to try to meet those needs, we have to be cognizant that those needs are present. And so those needs then sometimes can influence how they talk to us and about us in the classroom. And I'm not necessarily going to offer ways in which you can meet those needs, because I think those reflect just more of who you are, where you're at, that type of thing. But I think any student affairs person on your campus can tell you that some of these needs are rising. The number of universities and colleges with some sort of a food bank for their students is astounding. That maybe 20 or 30 years ago we didn't even have or didn't think the need existed, but they're there. Hungry students can't learn a whole lot. That works. We know that K through 12 students, so it works well with college kids as well. Another set of needs that students have that becomes relayed through the interactions with us, and that we sometimes misjudge because we're judging the interaction rather than the need that's driving it, is, if you think back to Schutz's traditional interpersonal needs of inclusion, affection, and control. One thing I've learned over teaching over time, I guess, is that if you stop and think about where that student's coming from in terms of an affection need or an inclusion need or a control need, it really allows you to reframe your perception of the student. I had a student several years ago who every day was a question, right? Why are we doing this? Why do I need this? Even one day I said, everybody pull out your books because we're going to go to page 22. Why do I need my book? Oh, you need your book. And at first I was bothered by it, taken a little bit aback about it, didn't let it show, but still was like, oh, he's driving me nuts. And then he wanted to see me outside class about something. And while we're sitting in my office, the same questions kept popping up, and it just dawned on me, that this student has an interpersonal need for communicating. It has nothing to do with me, and actually made me reframe the student in a whole different light. And so rather than dread his questions or get annoyed by his questions, I just went along with the questions, right? All right, so we have to remember that our students have inclusion needs, affection needs, and control needs that may not be met otherwise. Sometimes the classroom is where they surface because we're willing to talk with them. And then we also have to remember that a lot of our students have what we call basic academic needs that sometimes at the college level get ignored because we don't think about it. And again, most students never come out and say, I have this need, but the need is relayed through their questions or comments, or even, or their lack of questions and comments. So some of the basic needs that students have is, one, they have a need to understand our learning goals and our learning objectives. Going along with what we talked about yesterday with teaching philosophy, you have to have a sense of why you're there, right? And most of us probably have articulated somewhere, maybe just in our minds, what we're doing that day in class. But we need to also be able to articulate that to our students as well. Whether you do that verbally at the beginning of each class, whether it's written down somewhere, whether you indirectly state it, students have a need to understand why we're having them do what they do. And just saying things like, well, because, or, I'm the teacher, those don't work. We know they don't work. And if you can articulate why you have, why you're having students do what you're having them do, then you need to rethink about, again, what it is you're supposed to be doing in the classroom. It sounds a little dramatic, but I think you understand what I mean. Students also have a need to be an active learning participant. It is interesting. When you ask students say if they participate in class, students will say yes, but yet they never talk in class. But say, well, but I take notes and I'm listening and I react visually or verbally sometimes to what you say, and that counts as participation in their mind. And it probably should count as participation in our mind as well. So the idea here is that students have a need to be active learners. Even if you're teaching a large lecture class, you can still do things to get your students actively involved. And again, part of that goes back to yesterday's talk. What is your educational philosophy? What teaching perspective do you operate from? Because those are going to affect how active learning works in your classroom. They have a basic academic need of the relevance of the content to them, whether it's a personal interest, a career goal, doesn't really matter, but they want to see the relevance. And we have to be able to articulate that either verbally or on paper, but those things are key. And a final one I'll just mention is that all students, in terms of basic academic needs, need to experience success in some way. Now, one thing we have to remember is that students will define success subjectively. I think we've been trained to think that, success is an A on a test or being chosen to be a leader in a group activity or something along those lines. Not all students want that. For some students, a C is the best they really legitimately can do. And we have to recognize that as such. And, I can remember when I've taught communication research methods off and on over the years, that success is real. I think that academic need is so key in that particular class. I do a lot of activity. We do a lot of hands-on. That's part of my experimental transmissive philosophy and perspective. I think you have to be able to do it to see how it works. Trial and error. And I can just remember as little, Methods is a class not a lot of students don't always take, but there would be those instances where that individual success of being able to interpret, let's say, a t-value table, wow, or being able to identify if a variable is, a interval or ratio, little things like that, okay, which we might say, well, that's a basic, right? Those are knowing the levels of measurement is the basic building block, is a building block of a methods course. It is maybe to us, but not necessarily to students. All right, so realizing that students have, communication anxieties and apprehension, they come to us with different learning modalities. They come to us with a varying level of academic needs. Now, we might not be able to do much about what happens outside of class. Okay, we may not be able to meet their inclusion, affection, or control needs, or their physiological or safety needs, but we certainly can meet their academic needs, which is the need to understand our goals and objectives, to have to know the relevance of the content, to be an active learner, and to experience success in some way. Now, I raised that, or I mentioned this notion of the the academic needs, is because they do influence then the impressions the students are going to make of us, and as well as the reasons why they talk to us. So let's talk for a few minutes about the impressions that students make about us. Now, in the instruction communication literature, there's a great deal of research on one of the variables, not as much on the other two that I'm going to talk about. I like to call these impressions, and I'm going to write them down and then show them to you, because students do this starting on day one. And this is as we all know, this is one reason why that first day of class is so important. But we find is there are three basic impressions that students make of us, all right? And, I've got my little board, if I could figure out which side to put it on. So here are three impressions, if you want to write them down or just get them in your mind, and then we'll talk about each one in a little bit more detail. These are impressions that students make about us starting with the first day of class. They make these impressions throughout the class. Now, we don't have a whole lot of longitudinal research on these three, but suffice to say, you recognize it as you're teaching, all right? So one thing we want to keep in mind is that whether students want to talk to us is going to be partially based on how credible they find us, the level of attraction they associate with us, and then whether they think there's some sort of homophily between the two of us. All right, so we'll start off and talk a little bit about credibility. This one you've heard probably a little bit about because it is one of the more widely researched constructs in instruction and communication. But credibility as a whole boils down to the notion of believability. Do students find you to be believable? And when we talk about credibility, credibility consists of three dimensions. So we're talking about your believability across three dimensions. Now, the three dimensions are competence, character, and caring. Now, competence refers basically to, do they find you believable as a subject matter expert? And for a lot of us, our education lends to that, the title of, let's say, doctor, or your experience, maybe having taught in a department for 15 years or having taught a particular type of student your whole career. Those things go along with this notion of competence. Now, for a lot of students, competence is assumed at the college level. Just by virtue of the legitimate role that you're playing as the instructor. So being in front of the classroom, being in charge, most students respect that and go along with it. It isn't until you start, maybe demonstrating that you don't know your subject that competence becomes an issue. But for the most part, competence isn't something in terms of credibility that most students think about initially, because they just assume you're in charge, you're the teacher, you should know something, all right? The second dimension of credibility is called character. Now, sometimes in the literature it's called trust. It really just depends on what article you're reading and by what authors. Character refers to your believability as a good person. And we might think about as instructors at the college level, again, why is this so important? Why would our character become an issue? Well, it does. Most students want to believe and want to assume, that you're just good, that you have, there's no ill will present, that you do want them to succeed, that you're not unethical, that you're fair. For a lot of students, fairness is important to them, and being consistent in that fairness, which we know sometimes can be difficult, right? The third dimension of credibility is caring, and this is probably the most important of the three because, again, competence is something that they assume you have. Character is something they may want, but they can overlook it in the grand scheme of things, particularly if they're doing well or like the class. But caring is important. Caring is when they find whether you're believable in terms of having their best interests at heart. Students want you to be understanding. They want you to be empathic. They want you to be responsive. Now, we know that can sometimes be difficult. We get it. Sometimes our empathy, we're low on empathy for the day, or there's a student, who tests those boundaries of whether we can provide empathy. But a little empathy can go a long way. And I think, again, anecdotally, I think for some of us, as we made that move from face-to-face to online teaching this semester, that, is something that probably was more important to your students than you might realize. I know that when I know anecdotally from talking to some of my colleagues and talking to some students too, commenting on whether the instructor was caring meant a big deal to them over the last 8 weeks. And for some of us, we might not even stop to think about that, but that is key. All right, so credibility is that first issue. It's all about believability. If students believe you to be competent, they find you have character, and they think you are caring, they're going to want to talk to you. They're going to want to talk with you after class. They will email you. They will call you. Now, I'm not suggesting that because now that's not to say every student's going to just start calling you or whatever because they perceive you as credible. But these things are important. And like I said, competence, when you look at the research, actually, if you look at the 3 dimensions of credibility, competence sometimes has no effect per se on a particular behavior. Like students don't necessarily participate more in class because you're competent, but they might participate more in class because you're caring. Okay? So, that's just something to think about there. The second impression students make about us, and I don't think we think enough about this, particularly the third one, which I'm going to mention in a second, is attraction. Now, attraction is sometimes called attractiveness. This basically reverts down to whether students find something. The way I like to describe it is, credibility is about believability, attraction is about appeal or desire. And you don't want to take that in the wrong direction. But is there something appealing about you that students like? And when you look at the attraction literature, and this stuff goes back into the 1970s in communication, and particularly with instructional communication. But there are 3 types of attraction that students may have for us. Now, the first one is physical. And physical attraction just means that they find something about your personal appearance appealing. Now, like most people, physical attraction might be something that's more important initially when a relationship begins, but wanes over time. And pretty much the same things works with us. Students aren't necessarily looking at your personal appearance per se in terms of just what your body looks like. It would include things such as how you're dressed, whether you have a scent or a smell that's attached to you, that some students like and don't like, or at least can recognize. I tend to wear a lot of cologne. And I've had students tell me, "Oh, Dr. Myers, I know you're in the building because I can smell you when I walk in." I'm like, okay, maybe I should stop wearing so much cologne. But the bottom line here is that with physical, it's not as important. Just like with competence, the physical dimension of attraction is not as important when it comes to students wanting to talk to us. But, unfortunately, some students do pay more attention to that, and they do pay attention in some points to how you're dressed. And I know that can be a sore point for some of us because we think we should dress however we want. I mean, we're not going to get into that. You all have a sense of how you think you should appear in the classroom. And actually, some of us work in institutions where there is an expectation of how you should dress. So we'll just leave that at that. The second one is called social. The second element or second dimension of attraction is the social component. And this really is, could students, this is really their personal liking for you. Do they consider you to be someone that they could be a friend with? Do you demonstrate some of those friend-like qualities? When we tell students, oh, I'm here for you. If you ever need to talk, I'm here for you. You're demonstrating possibly some caring with credibility, but you're really demonstrating a level of social attraction. And we do find that is important for some of our students. If they're not going to come talk to you during their office, they may not come talk to you during your office hours if they rate you low in social attraction. And one thing you want to keep about all this stuff is it's not, none of this is meant personally, right? It's not like students sit around and think and talk necessarily, and they certainly don't use this terminology. And of course, with all this, you have to be comfortable yourself. So some instructors promote the social attraction and others do not, and that's fine. Everything we talk about throughout this week, it's not going to work if you're not comfortable with it or if you don't like it, And I will tell you, especially as I've grown older, I want to socially distance myself for a lot of different reasons. Okay, when I was younger, I was more interested, but as I've grown older, it doesn't mean I'm not friendly, it doesn't mean I'm not approachable. It just means that I don't necessarily want to be viewed as a friend by my students at this point in my life. All right, the third dimension, which I like a lot, because I think this is really important for us as instructors, is what's called the task dimension. Now, obviously, if you're task attractive, this means that you are someone with whom students want to work. All right, and this can range on a whole continuum. They might value, if you're task attractive, some students might view you as easy and pleasant to work with. And when I say work, I mean in the classroom, in that student-teacher relationship. But think about it. If you have students who want to complete an independent study with you, or in the graduate level, they want to complete a thesis or a dissertation with you. Now, some of that might be based on your competence level, right? But a lot of it is based on whether they find you task attractive. They get a sense of how you work and how you operate while you're teaching. If you're someone who, if you're motivated to help students find an internship or just to help them in general, they might also view you as high in social attraction. So sometimes that's a difficult concept to wrap around our heads, but not necessarily. So if you are, task attractive, that's not a bad thing. Actually, none of them are bad things, but this is just what we have to consider. If you have students who never come to you for help despite their struggles, it might be because they just don't view you as task attractive. And this is just something you have to think about and figure out how you can change that impression. Because remember, this is all perceptual. This is what students see. And this is why, when we go into Wednesday and Thursday, why your in-class rhetorical and relational behaviors are important. Because those behaviors influence the perception and they affect how these perceptions change. Now, the third one, the third dimension, or the third impression, I'm trying to find my little board here, is homophily, right? So credibility, attraction, we talked about. Homophily just refers to how similar are you to your siblings? How similar are you to your students, all right? Now, add to, homophily can take various forms. The two most prevalent forms at this point are attitude, and background. There are some others: values, appearance, demographic, but attitude, do you share the same attitudes as your students? And then, background, do you have some things in common? Now, the background could include a lot of different things. It could be demographics. It could be, it could be where you live, where you're from. Again, I'll have students ask me, especially in my large lecture classes, where are you from? And I'll tell them originally I'm from the Midwest, and I say I'm from Illinois. And occasionally I have that out-of-state student who comes up to me, oh, I'm from Illinois too, where are you from? So that's one way in which you can, stress the background. And so you can purposely do this, obviously, but so background is going to be things like that. Attitudes would be really everything else, your values about things, and this also depends on how much you talk in class and how much you disclose. Political affiliation, I think that's the easiest one. Just your attitude towards social issues, how your attitude toward people in general, And obviously a lot of this, again, we disclose in class or we share things about ourselves. And sometimes we're not aware that we're creating this homophily between students. I mean, I think it's rare for us to say, oh, I'm just like student X or student Y. It's the converse. Students identify, and again, this sometimes will affect whether they want to participate with us in class, because if they think they have nothing in common with you, then they might be less so inclined. All right, so these are what we call our impressions. So students, again, look to you starting on day one as to whether you are credible, whether they're attracted to you in some way, or find something attractive. You could say too, I don't like the word attractive in that sense, or if there's some degree of homophily. And what we have found, in just looking at when you look at the research in general, we find that certain behaviors of students can be predicted by these impressions. Their learning can be affected by these impressions. So what you just want to take away from this really is just stop and think about, how do you come across as credible, or what's your credibility? How does it increase or decrease? How do you come across as attractive to your students? How do you come across as similar? But more importantly, I think you have to ask yourself too, is how important is it to you that that students have these impressions of you? And again, I think this goes back to why we're in the classroom. No right or wrong answer, but this just goes back to what you think your job is and what your ultimate end goal with your students is. So in addition, so students will make these impressions of you. Now, what we've also found in several research studies over the past years is that these impressions then affect or have a relationship with the motives the students have for communicating with you. This is an area of research that I've been working on for the last 20 years or so with my colleagues Matt Martin and Tim Mote, and then with a few other people as well, usually my graduate students. But the idea here behind motives is that students communicate with us. Some students, not all, but our students will communicate with us because that communication satisfies some sort of need that they have. So the word motive and need can be used interchangeably. So you want to stop and think about, if on an average day you have several students talk to you, and when I say talk, this could include any in-class behavior. It's not necessarily one-on-one talk before or after class. This would be during class. This could be reflected in the emails that you receive or don't receive. This is also reflected in the out-of-class communication students have with you. So students are going to be motivated to communicate with us to satisfy a need that they have. So back in it was late 90s, 1998, 1999, I was working on a project of motives with Matt Martin and Tim Mote. And we were able to come up with 5 general reasons or motives behind why students want to talk to us, why they're motivated to communicate with us. And so I wrote them down here. And I'll hold it up a little bit while I'm talking so that you can get a sense of them. So the first 5 in black were the 5 modes we came up with in the late 90s that we've studied for the last 20 years. The 3 in blue are more recent that researchers have come up with as well. And I would argue there's a lot of different reasons why students are motivated to communicate with us. So this is not the end all to be all. But the first 5 we've really done quite a bit of research on and have an understanding of why of how these work and why they're used. So the first motive is called relational. And when students want to communicate with us for a relational need, it's because they really want to develop a personal connection with us. Again, interpersonal in the sense of just that dyadic relationship, that dyadic interaction between two people. It's not relational in that sense. But they want to develop a personal connection with us. And so this, they might see a potential relationship of some kind, even if it's a working relationship. They might perceive it as a potential friendship, because we do know that some of us do become friends with our students over time. But they find something there's something relationally there that they like. And again, this can be largely informed by those impressions that students have made of us. The functional motive, that's the second one, has to do with functionality in the classroom. Students who are motivated to communicate for the functional reason need information to do well. And well is subjective again, to do well in the classroom. So, the student that asks you questions about the assignments, but never anything else, is definitely demonstrating a high functional need. Keep in mind that students can use all 5 of these. They can use one of you. They might be motivated to communicate you for any number of the 5, and it's definitely teacher and classroom specific. So I may have a high need, or to communicate with my my comm theory teacher for relational reasons, but in my methods class it's all functional. And that's perfectly fine. It's just, these are just demonstrating why students want to talk to us. So the third one is the participatory motive, and this is where the student wants to demonstrate their involvement in the classroom, their knowledge of the material. It's all revolves around relaying something about what they've learned back to you, or suggesting that they're interested in the learning process. Keep in mind that sometimes this motive can be inflated if instructors require or grade participation. So you may have students who are motivated to communicate with you for the participatory motive solely because they have to. You've set up the classroom or the course so that they have to talk with you. Nothing wrong with that either, all right? But just keep in mind that could be why they're motivated. It has nothing to do with you per se. It's more due to a structural component of the course. The fourth motive, again, I'll hold up my dry erase board, is called the excuse-making motive. Now, I will say off front, the first 3, relational, functional, participatory, we typically regarded these as being, I guess, the more positive or pro-social motives, with the other 2, excuse-making and sycophancy, being more of an individual motive. And what I mean by that is, let me explain those 2 and then you'll understand what I mean. With the excuse-making motive, students are motivated basically with you to offer some sort of reason as to why something is blank, not done, not started, not considered. They're offering some sort of reason for why their work or their task has not been completed. And what we have found over the years with this is this motive really tends to be more tied to the student more than to the teacher. And what I mean by that is, when a teacher engages in behavior X, Y, or Z, you'll have students who are relationally, functionally, participatory. They're motivated, right? They want to relate to you. They have a functional need to talk. They want to participate. They're not necessarily going to communicate for excuse making, because it doesn't have much to do with us per se, right? It's more rooted in the individual. And chances are, if you have a student who uses the excuse-making motive with you, they're probably using it consistently across their classes. We consider this to be along the lines of a trait. And that's not to say all excuses are bad, but the reality is that there's not a whole lot of pro-social behavior that you can do that will decrease the excuse making, because it really comes from the student. And the last one is an interesting one, because we are, our thinking has changed on this over the years. So the fifth motive, so we have relational, functional, participatory, excuse making, and sycophancy as our fifth motive. We define the sycophancy motive as one in which students want to seek approval from you. In one of our earlier works, and we call it being brown-nosed, or I think in one of the readings for today, in the 2002 chapter that I've included as a reading, I think we even use the word brown-nose. What we've been finding over the years is that, and we originally thought that this was a student that was purposely trying to, this was a student who purposely wanted to be seen favorably because they were hiding or covering up something. That was our initial thought when we first started studying this. What we find writing lately, though, is that teacher in-class behaviors also influence the sycophancy motive. And so what we're starting to reconceptualize this maybe is just students who need approval without an ulterior motive. When we first started thinking about sycophancy, like if a student asks you, how you're doing, some teachers say, oh, you're just trying to get on my good side. Well, maybe they are, but we don't know the reason behind that, Some people are just sycophantic in general because that's a learned communication behavior that they have. All right, and then finally, we've come up with 3 new ones over the last couple of years. And when I say we, I mean instructional comm researchers. The first one we found is a 6th motive called academic concerns, which is where students are motivated to communicate you because there's a discrepancy. They want to resolve a discrepancy between maybe an ideal grade and the grade they're receiving. So it goes beyond the functional motive of just being able to do things right here and now. The academic concern motive is a little more encompassing in terms of looking at their overall academic performance. And they want to talk to you to basically reconcile those two states. Encouragement is a motive that has appeared in the advising literature, where advisees, and this probably makes sense, and this might go to what I was talking about sycophancy a second ago, is where advisees are motivated to communicate to their academic advisors because they want encouragement from that person. They want affirmation, they want reassurance. And so that might be a subset of sycophancy at this point, but we have not studied that in that sense. And then the 8th one would be mentoring, which occurs when students are motivated to communicate to their instructors to gain insight about their future career plans. I just conducted a study with several of my students actually on mentoring as a motive, and we did find that this is one reason why our students are talking with us, because they realize we're valuable or influential contributors to their success outside the class or outside when they leave us. All right, so it looks like we're running out of time because apparently I talked too much. But in any case, what we discussed today was teaching from the student perspective. The idea here is the students come to our classroom, with a series of needs, and these needs are going to influence how they make impressions of us and and whether they're motivated to communicate with us. So what you want to get from today really is just think about how you come across, all right? Are you credible? Are you attractive? Is there homophily present in the, And then do these impressions the students make of you, do these affect then their motives for communicating with you? In the readings, there are a couple articles that we have found, yes, impressions are important. And then there's also some other research out there as well. All right, so on that note, I had a cough drop in today. I'm sorry, my throat is a little dry. So on that note, we'll stop, and then we'll pick up tomorrow with teaching from the relational perspective. All right, have a good day. See you tomorrow.